Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Can everyone hear me? Or okay, so let's get started. Sorry about all the technical difficulties this morning. We should be all set for Wednesday, but I thought I would just record this for both sections. So you'll have it available and you can use it to learn the material and study. Of course, we can't do pull everywhere questions through this approach, but certainly I want you to pay attention to the pull everywhere questions and kind of imagine answering them as we move through this. Okay, so I wanted to start by kind of recapping how we've gotten to ecosystems, which is what we're going to be working on today. We started with our introduction to ecology and the abiotic environment. We characterized this physical environment and really mostly focused on climate components. Okay. Then we jumped into this niche concept, which looks at how individual organisms interact with their physical environment. Then we spent a couple lectures on population ecology, right? Learning about how populations grow in size and eventually reach some carrying capacity, right, when they run out of resources. And we just finished up a long section on community ecology. So that was really all last week was devoted to community ecology. And this is where we began to look at interspecific interactions. So interactions between different species and how they affect community structure. So today, we'll be getting into ecosystems, okay? And this is kind of the next larger scale of ecology. And what we'll really be looking at is how energy and chemicals are exchanged between organisms and their physical environment, okay? Working kind of at this community level, but adding in abiotic or physical factors. And of course, ecosystem ecology is one of our organizational scales that emphasizes energy flow and chemical cycling between organisms and the environment. That's the definition of ecosystem ecology, which is our focus today. And here is the reading, if you choose to do so. Okay, so here are the key concepts. We're going to start with this idea that energy flows and chemicals cycle. And this is really essential to everything we're going to be talking about today, but also on Wednesday. Okay, so this is kind of our guiding principle. So I'm going to spend some time on this idea. But first, what is an ecosystem? Okay, let's define an ecosystem. So an ecosystem consists of a biological community, right, which is what we just finished studying, right? By biological community, we mean all the organisms that coexist and interact in the same time and place. But here we're adding abiotic factors to this biological community. So we're looking at kind of these exchanges between organisms and their physical environment, or between whole communities and their physical environment. And really what ecosystem ecology deals with mostly is the transfer of energy and chemicals between biotic and abiotic environments. Okay, that is really the core, the crux of ecosystem ecology. So here we have a picture, a diagram from your textbook of an ecosystem. We have organisms, and we also have their physical environment that they inhabit. Okay, and I'll use this diagram to kind of introduce you to this principle. Okay, and this is that energy flows and chemicals cycle. All right, repeat that: energy flows, chemicals cycle. Okay, like I said, this is going to be kind of the guiding principle for this entire lecture, and also what we get into on Wednesday. So I'll kind of explain to you what I mean by this. Let's start with energy. Okay, so all organisms have energy inside of them. We need energy to maintain ourselves, to grow, to reproduce, just to function. Energy is required. All right, so all living organisms have energy. And all of this energy initially comes from the sun. Okay, so that is the input, the energy input to the Earth is the sun. Okay, eventually the sun will make its way through our plants. Okay, we'll talk about how plants can convert sunlight into chemical energy. And then, of course, our herbivores will eat the plants and get energy that way, and so forth. And energy will move through what I'll introduce to you as a food chain. But all this energy eventually is lost. Okay, it is lost as heat. So you can think of energy as making a one-way trip through an ecosystem. Okay, it starts with the sun and it leaves as heat. That's what I mean by energy flows, all right? A one-way trip. But chemicals are different, okay? Chemicals cycle. If energy flows, then chemicals cycle. And what I mean by that is that these chemicals, such as nitrogen, carbon, etc., they are present in fixed amounts in ecosystems or in the biosphere, okay, which is our global ecosystem. They're present in fixed amounts, and they just make their way between the biotic and abiotic components of ecosystems. Okay, so they're just kind of recycled. They don't come from the sun. They're present in fixed amounts, and they just are, like I said, recycled. And it turns out that ecologists didn't come up with these ideas, or this principle. It actually comes from physics and chemistry. Okay, we can apply these basic laws of physics and chemistry to ecosystems. So we'll start with the second law of thermodynamics, which states that energy conversions are not completely efficient. Okay, so some energy is always going to be lost as heat when energy is converted. Okay. And so conversions happen in the case of a food chain. Okay, so energy starts with the sun. It makes its way into, plants convert this sun's energy into chemical energy. And the energy makes its way up the food chain through feeding interactions. Okay, organisms feeding on one another. But at all points along this path of energy, energy is going to be lost as heat. Okay. So this is why energy flows and does not cycle. And in terms of chemical cycling, we can draw on the law of conservation of mass. Okay, so this law states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. Okay, so chemical elements are continually recycled within ecosystems. Chemicals are matter, right? And again, they can't be created, they can't be destroyed, so they are just recycled. And we can see that in the nitrogen cycle. It's not a one-way flow, it's a loop, right? As nitrogen makes its way throughout organisms and throughout the physical environment. And I just want to kind of hammer this home. This is a figure from your textbook that, again, emphasizes this point that energy flows and chemical cycle, right? So we'll start with energy flow, which is shown in the red arrows. All energy comes from the sun initially, and then it makes its way into primary producers and so forth. And throughout this kind of food web, if you will, these are all different types of organisms. But at each step, it's lost as heat. And those are these squiggly lines kind of coming off that are labeled as loss of heat. Okay, so energy flows. But again, chemicals cycle, and that's shown in the blue lines. Okay, so energy or chemicals do not come from the sun, but they are just continuously recycled within ecosystems. Okay, so that will finish our first point. And now we'll move on to our second concept, which is energy transfer efficiency through food chains. Okay. So again, the sun supplies the earth with energy. Without the sun, all of our ecosystems, everything alive, everything living on earth would vanish. Okay, it would just disappear. Okay, because there would be no energy to support it. And what the sun really supplies the earth with is radiant energy. Okay, it's energy in the form of sunlight. Of course, most organisms, or lots of organisms, can't really do much with sunlight, right? They can't really take up energy from radiant energy. But certain organisms can. So which organisms can convert radiant energy into chemical energy? My hope is that someone would be raising their hand and saying plants, and you would be absolutely correct. Okay, so plants convert radiant energy, as we'll see, into chemical energy. So they'll take up energy from the sun with their chloroplasts. They'll take in this sunlight, and they'll also take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they will convert this to chemical energy, right? So this is, I'm showing you up here, the equation for photosynthesis. And the chemical energy is actually stored in this molecule here, C6H12O6, which is glucose or some carbohydrate. And the chemical energy is actually stored in the carbon-carbon bonds, okay, in this glucose molecule. And this is why we call plants primary producers, because they make their own energy, okay? They produce chemical energy, okay? That's something that no other organisms can do, at least from the sun. So we have a measurement of this process, and that is the conversion of radiant energy into chemical energy, and we call this gross primary production, abbreviated as GPP, okay? So GPP is the amount of radiant energy converted to chemical energy by primary producers during a given time period, okay? Oftentimes measured in joules. It's a measurement. Joules are units of energy. So let's talk a little more about gross primary production, okay? Again, this is the conversion of radiant energy into chemical energy by plants. It turns out this is not an efficient process at all, okay? So of all the radiant energy, of all the sunlight that strikes a plant, most of this is lost as heat, okay? A lot of it's reflected, and some of this energy is actually just used to evaporate water, okay? Because it turns out that as you know, plants transpire. They lose water through their stomates, and this is an energy-consuming process. It takes energy to drive evaporation, okay? So in the end, only 1 to 2% of radiant energy is actually converted into chemical energy by the plant, okay? And we call that chemical energy production gross primary production. So let's kind of subdivide gross primary production a bit further, okay? So again, we're starting with solar energy. Energy stored during photosynthesis is what we call GPP, or gross primary production. But then we can subdivide our GPP into two things. So first is the energy used for cellular work, okay? It turns out that plants don't store all of this energy, this chemical energy, as biomass, but they have to actually use some of it, okay? So plants must actually burn chemical energy to grow, to maintain themselves, and to reproduce, okay? So we could attribute all this chemical energy burning to cellular respiration or metabolic activities. We'll just call this, we'll denote this as R, okay? Just the energy that plants have to burn to, again, maintain themselves. So if we, let's go back to, I should say, what's remaining after plants use some of this energy for cellular work is net primary production, okay? And that's the energy that's actually stored as biomass, so the chemical energy that makes its way into plant biomass. So net primary production, which we oftentimes measure in terms of biomass, is equal to gross primary production minus respiration, okay, minus these losses due to respiration by the plant itself. It's just the plant burning its own energy. And we can look at a map of spatial variation in net primary production. So like I said, net primary production is often measured in kilograms of carbon, okay? It's just plant biomass, essentially how much plant biomass is there. And this map is a heat map showing you how does net primary production or plant biomass change around the world, okay? How does it differ? How does it vary around the world? So high areas of net primary production are shown in red and yellow and green. And the low areas of net primary production are shown in black or purple, okay? And you might notice that there is a lot of primary production in the tropics, okay? Quite high net primary production there, lots of plant biomass, lower NPP in the deserts, and a fair bit of NPP in the temperate regions, right, where we have these forests. Yeah, and also there is some net primary production happening in the oceans, due to phytoplankton, right? Those are plants that live in the ocean. So here would be a clicker question or a poll everywhere question. I would ask you, given this map, which of the following environmental variables would you expect is most directly and also positively related to net primary production? Is it precipitation? Is it temperature? Is it wind? Or is it sunlight? And my hope is that you would select the choice of precipitation, right? Because there is high primary production, net primary production in the tropical rainforests, which was, as we learned, get lots of precipitation. But there's low net primary production, for example, in the deserts, okay, which get much less precipitation, hardly any at all. So it's clearly not a temperature phenomenon. It really depends mostly on precipitation, okay? This is exactly what we see in this figure, okay? So precipitation increases net primary production. And again, all I'm talking about here is the amount of plant biomass in a location. So here we have net primary production on the y-axis, mean annual precipitation on the x, and we could see this positive relationship. And if we look at the equation for photosynthesis, this shouldn't be so surprising, right? Because H2O is an important input to this photosynthesis reaction, okay? More water, more carbon production by plants. Okay, so where does this energy go next, right? It's a good question. My hope is, I was going to ask you all this question, but I hope that you would say, whoops, herbivores, right? We learned about herbivores, and these are essentially consumers that eat plants, right? So we can call herbivores primary consumers because they are the first level of consumer, right? They eat plants, okay? And plants are our primary producers. Next, we can kind of make our way up this food chain, if you will. Secondary consumers, like this songbird, will consume primary consumers, like this caterpillar. And finally, we can get to this level of tertiary consumers, which are our carnivore. Another example of a carnivore. In this case, we have birds of prey that might consume songbirds, or our secondary consumers, right? So this is kind of this pathway of energy flow up to what we call higher trophic levels. And I want to define this term trophic level. Trophic levels are groups of species that have similar ways of obtaining energy. Okay, so we can group different species into our primary producer category, or our primary producer trophic level, our primary consumer trophic level, and so on, okay, going all the way up to our tertiary consumer trophic level. So all the organisms that are within a single trophic level have kind of the same position within a food chain. Okay, so here's another poll everywhere question. Do you expect the tertiary consumer trophic level to contain more or less chemical energy than primary producers? You can think about this for a second. So my hope is that you would have answered less. Okay, tertiary consumers should contain less chemical energy than primary producers. All right. And the reason for this is because as chemical energy makes its way up this food chain, like I said, it's going to be lost as heat, right? That's our law of thermodynamics. Energy is always going to be lost as heat through these energy conversions, okay? So as a result, that means there's less available energy for higher trophic levels. And it turns out that energy transfer is in fact quite inefficient, okay, as energy kind of moves up trophic levels. So energy transfer between trophic levels is typically only 10% efficient, okay? So only 10% of the energy in a lower trophic level actually makes it up to one trophic level higher, okay? We can call this the 10% rule, okay? That's kind of the name for it. And we can see that in this figure here. So if we start with 10,000 joules of plant biomass, only 1,000 joules actually make it into the primary consumer trophic level, right? Because it's going to be lost as heat, and so forth, okay? So in the end, only 0.1% of the chemical energy that's fixed by photosynthesis, that is by our primary producers, shown in this green box here, actually reaches tertiary consumers, right? This top trophic level. Okay, it goes down to 10 joules. So it's a very inefficient process, energy transfer up as we go to higher trophic levels. And this is why, if we can kind of envision the amount of energy within different trophic levels, we might expect it to, and it actually does in nature, follow a pyramid shape, okay? So there's a lot more energy in the bottom row of this pyramid than there is at the top. And we get progressively less and less energy as you move up trophic levels, okay? And again, this is just because energy is lost as heat, and that's shown in these green arrows here. So each trophic level is losing energy as heat, and as a result, there's less available for the next higher trophic level. And it turns out that this inefficiency of energy transfer actually sets limits on food chain length, okay? And by food chain length, I just mean the number of trophic levels in a food chain. So the energetic hypothesis, which is what kind of suggests this, suggests that food chain length is limited by inefficient energy transfer, okay? So as a result, food chains in nature are typically only a few links long. You know, they might have, 3 to 5 trophic levels. There are no ecosystems or food chains that have 10 trophic levels, right? Typically, it's only a few links or a few trophic levels. I'd say 3 to 5. Okay, and this is just because energy transfer is so inefficient between trophic levels. There's just not much to get up to the top trophic level. Okay, so here's another poll everywhere question. Given the inefficiency of energy transfer through food chains, and what I mean by that is energy making its way up to higher trophic levels, Would you expect ecosystems with greater primary production to have more or fewer trophic levels? So my hope here is that you would have chose A. Okay, ecosystems with more primary production should have a higher number of trophic levels, right? Because it just means that there's more energy available to support those higher trophic levels. And I'll show you a study here that actually tested that hypothesis, okay, that more productive ecosystems with more primary production can support more trophic levels. So this data comes from water-filled tree holes, okay? So there are these kind of natural cavities that are formed in trees. They fill up with water, and they support kind of a mini food chain, okay? Kind of a mini ecosystem, if you will. And the primary production in these tree holes is leaves, okay? Leaves that actually fall into the tree holes. So that's kind of the primary production. That's the base of this food chain that exists in these tree holes. And we can see here, there's 3 treatments. The first bar here is the high level of leaf fall or litter fall. Okay, so this is just the control. This is kind of the normal amount of leaves that enter these tree holes. It's a high amount of productivity, and we also get a higher number of trophic levels. Okay, so 5 trophic levels is what you normally see in these tree holes. Okay, good number of trophic levels. But if you cut down the amount of leaves that are inside of these tree holes, you see that the number of trophic levels is reduced. Okay, so we can cut down our leaf litter amount to 1/10 of its natural rate, and we get about 3 trophic levels. And we can cut down the productivity to 1/100th of the natural rate of leaf fall, and we get just about 1 trophic level. Okay, so more productive ecosystems can support higher numbers of trophic levels, okay, which makes perfect sense if you think about this inefficiency of energy transfer. Okay, and the last concept we're going to get into today is chemical cycling, okay? And we'll touch on the carbon cycle eventually, but at first I just want to kind of introduce you to chemical cycling a bit. All right, so let's go back to our mantra, energy flows and chemical cycle, right? We just learned that energy comes from the sun, makes its way into plants through photosynthesis, gets into organisms that consume plants, and eventually, though, it's all going to be lost as heat, okay? It makes a one-way trip, okay? But chemicals are different, okay? Chemicals cycle, all right? They're present in fixed amounts. They don't come from the sun. And they are just kind of cycled in between our biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. So before we get into chemical cycling, I want to come back to our food chain here and think a little more about energy flow. And I was going to ask everyone, do you think that there's a missing trophic level, right? So this is the kind of food chain we've been looking at so far, where we have our primary producers, our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, and our tertiary consumers. But I want to ask you, is there something missing here? Okay. And this was, granted, kind of a tough question, but I'll explain to you what is missing. So, first of all, when all these organisms die, they will go into something, they will be turned into something called detritus. Okay. Detritus is just dead organic matter. Okay, so detritus can be made up of, dead leaves, dead animals, feces. Everything that's dead essentially goes into this detritus pool. Okay, and this is what detritus looks like, or can look like in the top right here. Okay, so just dead organic matter. And it turns out that there are species that are specialized to consume detritus. Okay, they actually get energy from detritus. Things like certainly bacteria and fungi are the dominant detritivores within ecosystems, but also things like worms. Okay, as you could see in this in our food chain diagram here. So in the case of worms, which are detritivores, they eat the detritus, they consume it, they get energy from it, and then they get eaten by primary carnivores, right? So they're able to actually take some of this energy that's left in the detritus and kind of bring it back into our food chain. So detritivores play some role in energy flow, but where they're really important, okay, and this is what I want you to recognize, where detritivores are most important is in chemical cycling, okay? They are particularly crucial for chemical cycling. And the reason for this is that they break down the detritus. So we see fungi that's breaking down leaf litter here. And then they release chemicals and nutrients, right? So plants can take them up again, okay? So if you didn't have detritivores, all those chemicals and nutrients would just sit there in the soil, okay, in the detritus. And plants wouldn't be able to take them up again because they're not available. But detritivores play this crucial role of releasing chemicals and nutrients. And by nutrients, I'm just mean chemicals that are important for organisms to support life. That's all I mean by that. So we can kind of I'm just using chemicals and nutrients kind of interchangeably. Don't worry about that. They're really all chemicals. So detritivores play a crucial role for chemical cycling. And we can see this kind of going back to our energy pyramid, right? This is what we looked at earlier, how energy comes from the sun. It's eventually lost as heat. But we could also think about put kind of chemical cycling onto this pyramid and see that all these trophic levels, when they die, they go into this detritus pool. They get consumed by detritivores. And then detritivores' role is really to recycle these nutrients or break down the detritus, release the nutrients, and make the nutrients available to primary producers again, okay, our plants. And this rate of decomposition is dependent on environmental variables, okay? So for example, we get higher decomposition, and that's, again, the role that detritivores are playing, breaking down detritus. So this rate of decomposition, it increases with temperature and moisture. Okay, so in warmer environments, we get a faster rate of decomposition, and also in wetter environments, we get a faster rate of decomposition. So this is just showing on the y-axis the percent of mass lost. We can think of this as a measure of decomposition. Okay, how fast is detritus being or how much detritus is being broken down as a function of mean annual temperature of different locations. And these different points, the color of these points represents different biomes. Okay, but across all these biomes, we see a positive relationship. Okay, higher mean annual temperature, warmer environment, higher rate of decomposition. So, given these positive effects of temperature and precipitation on decomposition rate, I didn't show you the effect of precipitation, but you have to trust me. More precipitation equals faster decomposition. In which biome would you expect the highest rate of decomposition? So which biome that we learned about has the warmest temperature and also the most precipitation? So my hope here is that you would have chose tropical rainforests, right? That's something we learned about in I think our very first lecture. The tropics have lots of rain, lots of precipitation, and they're certainly very warm as well. So yes, the rate of decomposition is highest in the tropics. But let's look at the temperate forests for a second here, before we get to our tropics and talk about what's happening there. So in temperate forests, decomposition is really slow, okay, because it is colder. And also you don't get as much rain as you do in the tropics. And what happens is, because there's not much decomposition, or it's happening so slowly, we get this accumulation of detritus or leaf litter, right? And that's what you see here. I mean, go for a hike. I'm sure maybe some of you went for a hike this past weekend like I did. and you noticed how much leaf litter there is on the forest floor, right? That's just detritus. And it will take a long time for that detritus to be broken down. So as a result, in temperate forests, much of the nutrients or the chemicals that are important for organisms are in the detritus, right? They're just in the detritus in the soil. They just kind of sit there because the rate of decomposition is so slow. But in tropical forests, we have very rapid decomposition, right? And that's what that was the answer to this poll everywhere question that I just showed you, okay? So as a result, in tropical forests, decomposition happens so quickly that there's actually not much nutrients left in the soil, okay? Essentially, anything that dies is broken down immediately and taken up by trees almost immediately, okay? So in tropical forests, only 10% of the nutrients are contained in soil, and the other 90% are tied up in trees. Now, the point I want to make here is that the tropics actually have very nutrient-poor soils, okay, because most of those nutrients or chemicals are in the trees themselves. Now, this is an issue. We've talked about deforestation in the tropics before, and it's an issue because if you log the tropics, right, if you clear cut them, you're actually taking those nutrients away from the ecosystem. You're stealing them, right? Because there's not much in the soil, it's all in the trees themselves. So really, if you wanted to log a tropical rainforest responsibly, you would have to kind of put back in the nutrients and the chemicals that you take away. But of course, that's not what happens. Okay, and the last point I want to make here or go through is some of our carbon cycle. Okay, so there are other really important cycles like the water cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the nitrogen cycle, but we're just going to focus on the carbon cycle. Okay, and by the way, your textbook goes through each of these, but like I said, we're just going to worry about the carbon cycle. So carbon atoms are the building blocks of life. Okay, most of life is carbon. So you probably heard that we are mostly made up of water, and that's true. But if you actually take the dry biomass, so if you remove all the water, carbon actually makes up 45 to 50% of living organisms. Okay, so carbon is all throughout everything that's alive, and that's why I put this food web up here. Okay, because it makes its way through organisms. And like we learned about earlier, the chemical energy that plants create is actually stored in carbon-carbon bonds. So energy is stored in these bonds. Now, importantly, though, we're not talking about energy here. Okay, we're talking about carbon atoms. Okay, carbon alone, which doesn't necessarily have any energy associated with it. And also say that cellulose is the most abundant organic compound on Earth. So it's the most abundant carbon-containing atom on Earth, or carbon-containing compound on Earth, and we find it in the cell walls of plants. Okay, but carbon doesn't just occur in organisms; it also occurs in the atmosphere. Okay, so it occurs as CO2, carbon dioxide, and also as methane. Okay, or CH4. And before we get into the global carbon cycle, I just want to introduce you to some basic terminology. So we can define pools or reservoirs as just kind of amounts of an element in a component of the biosphere, right? So we could have a pool of carbon, and it just holds some amount of carbon, right? The carbon is just kind of somewhat stable there, okay? And we'll look at different pools of carbon throughout the global carbon cycle. We can also define something called a flux, okay? And this is just the rate of movement of an element between pools, okay? So that's this red arrow that I just put up here. We have pool 1 and pool 2 shown in blue, and they're connected by some flux, right? Which is transferring in this case carbon, between from one pool to the other. So an example of this would be terrestrial plants, which we could consider a pool of carbon, right? They're made up of carbon. They have a certain amount of carbon, which is relatively stable. And photosynthesis would represent a flux, okay? Because photosynthesis describes, taking carbon out of the atmosphere in the form of CO2 and converting it into plant biomass, okay? So it's a movement between the atmospheric carbon pool and the plant carbon pool. Okay, so let's take a look at our global carbon cycle. I'm going to go through this, I think, again on Wednesday, but I wanted to go through it here. This diagram of the carbon cycle is one I really love. I found it on Wikipedia. It's not from your textbook, but I think it's a very good one and about as clear as a diagram as I can find on the carbon cycle. So there's a fair bit going on here, but I want to kind of take you through it. So follow me here. First of all, this figure kind of divides up, what we might think of as the part of the cycle that takes place on land, and then so on the right we have the part of the cycle that takes place in the oceans. Okay, so kind of terrestrial versus marine, if you will. Okay, and all the numbers here are in gigatons of carbon. Okay, so we're talking about huge amounts of carbon measured in gigatons. Okay. Remember, this is just our carbon atoms. So let's kind of make our way through this cycle. I'll point a couple things out to you here. First, let's start at the top where I've circled in red the atmosphere, okay, top left. That is a pool of carbon. So the atmosphere has 800 gigatons of carbon in it, okay, mostly in the form of CO2 and methane. Then we can see that photosynthesis is a flux of carbon, okay? So photosynthesis takes carbon out of the atmosphere and it puts it into plant biomass. And that's the next pool I've circled here, okay? Plant biomass holds 550 gigatons of carbon in it. This plant biomass, when it dies, some of it makes its way into the soil, okay? This is the carbon that isn't kind of, taken up again, okay? So we have this soil pool of carbon, which is 2,300 gigatons. And finally, if it kind of gets kind of deep enough in the soil, this carbon will make its way into kind of the fossil pool, okay? And that's just fossilized, organisms, dead organisms, plants and animals, okay? So that's kind of the one part of the carbon cycle. I'll take you through the other part, and we'll move into this marine environment. So there's also fluxes between the carbon in the atmosphere and the surface of the ocean. So we have these air-sea gas exchanges of carbon that are happening. And the surface of the ocean also holds a lot of carbon, a little more than the atmosphere, actually, 1,000 gigatons versus 800. And some of this surface ocean carbon gets used by phytoplankton, and eventually some of it will actually sink down into the deep ocean. And the deep ocean is actually the largest carbon pool, 37,000 gigatons. Okay, a lot of carbon in the deep ocean. So that's kind of a rough, that is the global carbon cycle kind of in a nutshell, okay? And we could look at our carbon pools by percent, and you could see the fossil pool is 15%. The ocean is a huge pool of carbon, 77% approximately. So most of the carbon is actually found in the ocean. Only 1.5% of carbon is found in the atmosphere, so it's relatively small by comparison. So I thought we'd finish up. I wanted to ask you a question, which is, which carbon pool are humans modifying most directly? Okay, and my hope is, this is not something I taught you, but I hope you would kind of know, because this is in the news a lot, that we are modifying the fossil pool of carbon. Okay, and that's where we're going to pick up with on Wednesday when we talk about global change. Okay, thank you, everyone. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties. I hope this was clear, and certainly feel free to ask questions in class on Wednesday if you want me to clarify anything I talked about today. Thank you.